Chapter 15. Holly stood quietly against the wall that concealed Diagon Alley. She was hiding under her invisibility cloak and waiting for the brick wall to open up to let someone out. It had been fairly easy to find the leaky cauldron once Holly remembered the name of the street it was on. Then she managed to get inside by waiting beside the door and slipping in after someone else opened it to go out. The interior of the leaky cauldron looked just as dingy and seedy as Holly remembered it. Inside were some seated people wearing wizard robes of green and gold. Other wizards wearing drab brown, black, and gray colors sat on the outside edges of the room, well away from the Slytherin ones. The place wasn't full, but there were enough people to make crossing the room tricky. Holly edged herself safely away from the door and then waited, watching to determine her best opportunity. She finally made it across the room while the proprietor was loudly discussing the bill with his Slytherin patrons. Their noise also covered the sound of the back door opening as well. Once outside, Holly had to stop again. It required a wand to open the back wall, and Holly had none. Also, there was a security guard in red and black standing at the wall. He had looked curiously at the opened door, but seemed to attach no importance to it, assuming perhaps the door hadn't been properly fastened in the first place. Taking no chances, Holly remained absolutely still in the guard's presence. She moved forward only when certain that the sound of her steps were covered by the sound of other wizards who came out the back door to go into the alley. One short, portly wizard in green robes had done just that. Unfortunately, the wizard's wand only made a small doorway instead of the huge archway Holly remembered. Holly got close, but wasn't able to get through the opening before it closed again. So Holly stood at the wall and waited. The security guard stood less than 2 meters away. The security guard looked thoroughly bored. When no one else was in the yard, he spent his time watching the continuous news shown on the Daily Prophet news screen. It was located on the right side of the wall of the Diagon Alley entrance. Holly found it nerve-wracking to stand so close to the guard, certain he would hear or see something that would awaken his suspicions and enable him to sense her presence. She took shallow, slow breaths, fearing he would hear her, and kept her eyes focused on the Daily Prophet news screen, afraid the guard would feel Holly's eyes on him if she looked in his direction. The news seemed pretty ordinary. Minister Lestrange announces era of peace and prosperity. Crime down 10%. New potions text available. Mudblood magic theft down. Hogwarts enrollment expected to increase. Quidditch match set for August. Interspersed between the headlines and articles were moving photos of persons wanted for breaking wizard laws. Holly recognized some of them from the Muggle Security Alert news, but these people were accused of wizard crimes, not acts of terrorism. With a start, Holly recognized a wanted photo of Ravenda. It showed her in the act of standing with her colorful beaded cornrow braids swinging gently side to side. The photo looked a lot like Ravenda, though Holly knew it must have been taken over 5 years earlier. The caption accompanying the photo only accused Ravenda of wizard crimes, but the photo panned out to show Ravenda standing between 3 very bloody, very dead bodies. It left no doubt as to what wizard crimes Ravenda supposedly committed. Holly carefully wiped away the tears that flowed unbidden to her eyes as she silently cried for the world both she and Ravenda had lost. It won't be long now, she mentally told the photo. Dumbledore will help us out. Among those photos displayed as wanted criminals was Holly's own photo. Her solemn face stared out at the world with long brown braids hanging down her shoulders on either side. Holly noted she was now accused of breaking wizard laws, instead of being somehow involved with a missing cruise ship. It seemed like an eternity, but suddenly Holly heard a low rumble behind her back. She turned her head to look and held her breath. Out of the corner of her eyes, she watched the bricks reform right behind her. Heedless of the possible noise, Holly scrambled quickly through the opening before it finished, angling herself off to one side. Even so, she narrowly missed bumping into a family of wizards impatiently waiting on the other side, anxious to get home. Holly could scarce contain her excitement at having finally gotten to Diagon Alley. Gringotts was only a short walk away. What would be in vault number 321? What had Dumbledore left her? Maybe the vault contained wizard money. Perhaps it had a port key or something else to get her into Hogwarts. The possibilities were endless. But whatever it was, Holly was sure the contents of the vault would help her, as the invisibility cloak had done. It was late, however, and Holly realized that Gringotts was probably closed. But just the thought of being so near her goal was exhilarating. Holly was content to find a quiet corner near the bank to sleep the night, in expectation of getting into Gringotts first thing in the morning. Holly took a deep breath as she stood with her back against the opening to Diagon Alley. She surveyed the whole alley while she waited for the wall to close behind her. She was so close to reading her objective, she didn't want to risk blowing it by being careless. Though the buildings looked the same, Diagon Alley seemed more grimy and dirty than Holly remembered it. That could have been just a trick of the light due to the late hour of the day. Diagon Alley was not crowded and bustling as she had last seen it, nor was it empty either. Vendors were slowly packing up their wares, while wizards wandered up and down, doing last-minute shopping. Holly noted 2 wizards in black robes and security uniforms striding purposefully towards her, rather, towards the alley exit. She moved sideways until she was well out of their way, and then stared at the 2. Tom Richards. That was definitely the taller of the 2, and next to him, Holly recognized Paige Crowley. Holly had met Richards during her last visit to this world. He had been angry and mean towards her. Richards was always angry in Holly's world, too, but now he looked confident and relaxed. He looked almost a different person. Paige, however, was eerily the same. She was still willowy and thin, with a pale face that contained no expression at all. Paige's waist-long black hair was neatly tied into a single braid and draped over her shoulder. The blood-red ribbons tied in it sparkled and showed prominently, even in the evening light. Holly could hear snatches of their conversation as they drew near. "Thought the Muggle security would be a bore, but it wasn't," said Richards cheerfully. "Too bad I can't tell you about it, but, well, you know, confidentiality and all that. It's the one thing I don't like about security, not being able to talk about it." Replied Paige noncommittally, while taking a sip from a squirmy straw stuck in the drink she held in her hand. "But it's the secrecy that makes working for security so interesting, don't you think? Knowing that no one else knows what we do." "True," agreed Richards thoughtfully as he pulled out his wand. "I expect once we're fully employed, we can be more open about it all, at least to each other." He counted out the bricks to open the wall. As he did so, Paige turned her head and looked directly at Holly. "No," thought Holly in a panic. "She couldn't be looking at me. I'm invisible, aren't I? But then, why else would she look in this particular direction?" In terror, Holly held her ground and looked back at Paige, rather than risk moving and making a sound. Holly noted Paige's familiar pale skin, its whiteness broken only by her black eyes and bright red lips. The color of Paige's long red fingernails matched her red lips, hair, ribbons, and crimson lining of her security wizard robes. Her black security uniform was a tailored jacket and form-fitting skirt that flared out gently at the hem, which fell modestly well below her knees. Paige took another sip of her drink and absently twirled the straw with her fingers while her unfathomable black eyes stared straight through Holly. At least that's what Holly hoped they were doing. Holly hoped there was something behind her that was the source of Paige's attention, but she never could tell with Paige. Holly hadn't been able to read Paige's emotions while at Hogwarts, and Holly suspected she still couldn't, even without wearing the invisible cloak. The brick walls of Diagon Alley reformed into a doorway. Without a word, Paige returned the straw to her mouth, took another sip of her drink, and then turned her face to the entrance. Holly gave a mental sigh of relief, but continued to watch Paige nervously. When the bricks stopped moving, Paige put her arm in Richard's and leaned against him while he put his wand away. "Shall we?" asked Richards grandly as he took a step towards the entrance, gently pulling Paige along. Paige looked again in Holly's direction. At Holly, it seemed. Holly's heart raced uncontrollably, and her eyes flickered around, anxiously seeking possible avenues of escape. While still staring towards Holly, Paige moved forward, allowing Richards to walk her through the entrance. Holly held her breath, not daring to breathe, until the wall reformed again, locking the two out of Diagon Alley. Paige was creepy in Holly's own world, and more so here. Holly moved away from the alley exit as fast as she dared. She wanted no more near misses like the one with Paige. Paige might not have seen Holly, but the experience was too unnerving to discount. Now, all Holly wanted to do was find Gringotts as fast as possible, and then, if it wasn't open, find a safe corner for the night. The alley was fairly empty, making moving easy. Though she had been there only once before, Holly was pretty certain she could locate Gringotts with no difficulty. It was, as she recalled, rather centrally located. "It should be just round this corner," thought Holly excitedly as she raced over the narrow but increasingly familiar cobblestoned street, heedless of the noise she might make. There were few people out to notice, and those that were busy making their own noises putting things away. Holly turned the corner and looked up. There, rising up majestically and towering above the other buildings, was Gringotts. The polished stone steps led up to the familiar-looking pillars that sheltered Gringotts' burnished bronze doors. But instead of the snowy white that Holly remembered, this Gringotts shone red gold in the setting sun. Holly stared in disbelief. What had happened to the original white building? Where were all the goblins? As she looked, Holly noted other differences. Red stone steps with sparkling gold flecks leading up to the entrance. A guard at the door in a red uniform, wearing red wizard robes. A huge circular indentation of the land and street all around Gringotts, and a mound upon which the building of Gringotts stood. Then Holly noticed the gleaming white ground on either side of Gringotts. White sparkles were everywhere on the ground, even between the cobblestones beneath her feet. Holly knelt down and touched the white stuff between the cobblestones. Sand. Fine, white, powdery sand. She had never seen sand so white, not even at the beach. Holly suddenly had a good idea what happened to the original Gringotts. It was still here, beneath her feet. With horrible certainty, Holly knew there was nothing in Vault 321 waiting for her. There was no Vault 321. Holly knelt a long time staring at the Gringotts building in front of her, while feeling the Gringotts that was between her fingers. Her mind was a blank whirl. Though Holly knew from experience what needed to be done in the Hogwarts trophy room, she had never known how to actually get to that room. Her knowledge of the wizard world was minimal. Her father openly hated wizards and witches and wanted nothing to do with them. Cousin Harry had respected her dad's wishes and had intruded on their lives as little as possible. Holly only knew of Diagon Alley and Gringotts because she'd been there with Cousin Harry. Of Hogwarts, Holly knew even less. She had flown there at night by motorbike once and taken a train the next year, but the train didn't run during the summer. Hogwarts was up north somewhere and protected by magic to keep the muggles away. Holly had no idea where it was located, let alone how to get there. Holly knew she had made it to Diagon Alley by pure luck. She'd been trusting that something in Dumbledore's vault would help her get to Hogwarts. With the vault and its contents gone, Holly suddenly felt cut off, cast adrift, utterly without hope, totally alone. Someone crashed into Holly's shoulder, stumbling and tripping in the process. Holly automatically stood and moved forward, oblivious of the person who had bumped into her and was now muttering curses due to his clumsiness. In a daze, Holly continued walking, taking slow, steady wooden steps forward, seeing nothing along the way, moving only for the sake of moving. She walked without conscious thought, taking whatever route seemed easiest. Holly passed the Owl Emporium as she walked, never noticing the simple sign in the window that read YCLF. Nor did she see a similar sign posted at the apothecary further down the street. On and on Holly walked, her numbed mind registering nothing but the despair within her. The sky darkened. Only a few lit torches illuminated the streets with eerie flickering shadows, and still Holly continued to walk. She blindly moved up one street and down the next, neither knowing nor caring where she went. Eventually, Holly's feet took her down a narrow lane that ended in a bricked-up wall. Holly stared blankly at the wall and then collapsed in an exhausted sleep. The skinny gray rat scurried down the lane in search of food. It was hungry, and there were some new scents to check out. The rat approached the source of the scent cautiously. It couldn't see anything, but could still smell something, and the scent was more important than sight. Working his way under some sort of obstruction, the rat finally reached his goal, the source of the scent. He brought his nose up close. His sensitive whiskers brushed the object. It twitched slightly. Startled by the movement, the rat hurried off. A rather large but scrawny, one-eyed, black and white striped tomcat spotted the movement of the rat in the distance. The cat leaped forward without hesitation before the rat would have had the chance to gain cover. It crashed mid-air into a solid wall of nothing. Stunned and surprised, the cat ran away. The rat ran off in the opposite direction, and the lane was quiet again. Holly stirred and sat up. She didn't know what had hit her, but something had, and she was now awake. She hadn't slept well at all. She had dreamed of her parents and Vernon begging her for help, and then turning to fine white Gringotts dust and blowing away in front of her. Looking around, Holly could dimly see other figures in the alley, wrapped in their robes, leaning against the walls. She noted the closed-off end to the street. Everything looked totally unfamiliar. Holly quietly stood, feeling stiff, sore, and cold. Invisibility cloaks did not work well as blankets. She adjusted her cloak, making sure it covered her completely, and then walked quietly back the way she had come. Holly had no idea where she was. Not that it really mattered. It wasn't as if she had any place special to find. She walked aimlessly up one lane and down the next. Then Holly encountered an older person in shabby wizard robes hurrying down the lane. Changing her speed to match his, Holly followed the person. As they walked in the gray morning, Holly saw a familiar security screen flashing brightly. It seemed different somehow. Holly paused to look. Again, Holly saw her photo featured prominently, but the heading had changed. The label now read, 1,000 galleon reward. Underneath it read, have you seen this person? 1,000 galleon reward will be given to the person who provides information leading to the identity and apprehension of this witch. Holly shivered and looked anxiously over her shoulder as she read the notice. Surely her luck could not hold forever. Diagon Alley had always been risky. It seemed more so after reading the revised notice. One could do a lot with 1,000 galleons. Looking around, it seemed as if there were a lot of people who could use that kind of money here. The older wizard Holly followed had continued walking out of sight while Holly had paused to read the alert. But Holly spotted a skinny witch with gray hair, wearing a faded blue patched robe and hat, walking swiftly in the same direction as the older wizard. Holly followed the witch down the street. She led Holly past Gringotts, which now looked more sinister than ever, shining blood red in the morning light, to a gray, tumbled-down cafe, with a faded, worn sign overhead reading, Florian's Fortescue's Ice Cream Parlor. The place obviously served more than ice cream, for the warm scent of freshly baked bread wafted out. Holly's stomach growled hungrily in response. Holly stared at the cafe thoughtfully. Unfortunately, several people crowded around the open entrance, making Holly's own approach too risky. Having already passed Gringotts, Holly knew where she was. Ignoring her growling stomach, Holly resolutely turned her head away from Florian's and its tempting scents. In doing so, she spotted another wanted wizard sign bearing her picture and reward amount posted boldly in front of the store, just opposite Florian. And then Holly saw another further down the street. They were everywhere. Holly's own face seemed to stare back at her accusingly. Refusing to let herself be distracted by the posters and what they meant, Holly kept her eyes fixed on the ground and continued on her way out of the alley, looking neither right nor left. In doing so, she missed the small sign in the window of the astrology shop next to Florian's that read, "Fortunes for Wycliffe." Holly found it much easier to get out of Diagon Alley than it was to get in. The doorway in the wall stayed open for long periods of time as person after person streamed into the alley for morning shopping. Holly was able to easily slip through between wizards going the other direction without being noticed. There was a new security guard on duty at the entrance. As she moved cautiously to the back door of the Leaky Cauldron, Holly noticed the Daily Prophet news screen no longer displayed the news. It only showed an enlargement of Holly's photo and proclaimed the reward for her capture. The Leaky Cauldron was full of patrons eating and talking. Holly carefully made it across the room, dodging people and using the existing noise to cover her presence. She heard a lot of murmured talk along the way. Who is she? 1,000 galleons? Have you seen her? Wonder why? Holly didn't stop to listen. The talk only made her want to get out faster, get away from all the people hunting her. The Muggle world seemed much safer at this point. Holly breathed a sigh of relief when she finally made it out the door of the Leaky Cauldron and was again walking down the sidewalks of Charing Cross Road. When Holly judged she was far enough away from the Leaky Cauldron, she found a quiet corner and drew off her invisibility cloak. The flood of emotions around her felt like a breath of fresh air. She knew it was more dangerous being visible, but Holly had felt stifled under the cloak. Now, at least, Holly could tell when danger was near. Holly carefully folded and stuffed the invisibility cloak under her shirt. Then she fished out the other 10-pound note. Waving it boldly in one hand, she scanned the road in search of a taxi. When one slowed to a stop in front of her, Holly opened the door and got in. "I'd like to go to Grimmauld Place," she told the driver in a clear, calm voice. Holly leaned back in the seat and closed her eyes, mentally bracing herself for what would come. She only knew of 2 places in London. Sometime during the middle of the night, Holly decided she wanted to go to Grimmauld Place. It was a rather risky decision, and one that would most likely get her killed. But Holly was out of options, and as for dying, well, that didn't sound all that bad anymore. "You sure this is where you want to go?" "What?" asked Holly, opening her eyes and looking around. The taxi had come to a stop on a curb in the middle of a small square. All around were grimy, forbidding-looking houses, some with broken windows, and most with peeling paint. Heaps of rubbish lay outside near many of the front steps. "I said, are you sure this is where you want to go?" repeated the taxicab driver. The taxicab driver seemed a nice person, and Holly could tell he was very worried about letting her off in a place like this. It did look rather disagreeable. But for the first time since the curse had happened, everything looked totally familiar to Holly. Nothing seemed to have changed here. "It's okay," assured Holly. "It's the right place." Her words didn't seem to reassure the driver much, so Holly added, "I have relatives who live here." Well, it was true, sort of. Holly handed the man her 10-pound note for payment and waited for the change. The driver reluctantly gave Holly some money. She opened the cab door and got out. Holly watched as the taxi drove out of sight before she turned her attention to the gap in house numbers between 11 and 13. Facing the area where a number 12 should have been, Holly closed her eyes and thought the words she had seen on a paper Cousin Harry had given her to memorize last year. "Harry Potter's house may be found at number 12 Grimmauld Place." Holly waited a moment and then opened her eyes. Nothing happened. Nothing had changed. It didn't work. Holly closed her eyes again, fighting back the tears of disappointment. What now? Wait for someone to come out? She doubted that would work. The house had probably been destroyed like everything else that was connected to Cousin Harry, and she had been so sure it would be there. Hadn't Cousin James said his dad had inherited the house from a bunch of Slytherins? Inherited! That was it. If Cousin Harry were dead, he wouldn't own the house, would he? What was the name of Cousin Harry's godfather, the one he inherited it from? Holly frowned, trying to remember. Sidney, Silas, Simon, Cyrus, Sirius? Yes, that was it, Sirius. Holly closed her eyes and reworded the sentence in her mind. Sirius Black's house may be found at number 12 Grimmauld Place. Holly kept her eyes closed a long time afterwards, afraid of what she would find when she opened them. Cousin Harry had made Holly a secret keeper by giving her the location of his home, but would it be enough knowledge? Would the revised spell work? Finally, Holly could bear it no longer. She opened her eyes. There, in front of her, was a grimy, battered house squished between the numbers 11 and 13. Holly gave a smile and delight at her success. Using her fingers, Holly brushed out some of the tangles in her hair, smoothing it. Then she walked up the worn stone steps, stopping in front of an ancient-looking door. The black paint on the surface of the door was shabby and scratched. In the center of the door was a single silver knocker, shaped in the form of a twisted serpent. Taking a deep breath, Holly lifted the knocker and firmly lowered it, landing it on the door with a loud rap. The vibration of a cell phone in his hand woke Daniel Pilkington almost immediately. He had fallen asleep, holding it, expecting some sort of response, all night. He looked over at Terica while he slid out of bed. She appeared fast asleep, with deep, even breathing, stirring only slightly when he replaced the covers. Daniel found his robe and quietly went into the parlor. Drawing out his wand, he whispered, "Muffliotto." Only then did he open the still vibrating telephone in his hand. Daniel put the phone to his ear. "Report?" he asked softly. "We got a survey call," came a whispery voice on the other end. Survey call? Daniel came awake immediately. He had been expecting a response from someone in Diagon Alley. Had the girl gotten in there? Did she miss the signs? Not need them? What happened? "What was the survey response?" Daniel asked quietly. "A cab driver called it in," said the voice, answering Daniel's question. "He picked up a passenger at the corner of Cranbourne Street and Upper St. Martin's Lane. He dropped her off at the end of Grimmauld Place." Description of the passenger? "A young girl with long blonde hair," replied the voice. Long? That was new. "Did you make payment?" "Yes." "Get reimbursement from account number," and he listed some numbers accordingly. "Acknowledged." Came the voice hesitantly. "Yes?" There was clearly more information to add. It must have been an informative cabbie. "This all apparently happened not 10 minutes ago," added the voice. "You sure?" If true, that was good news. She couldn't have gotten far yet. "Positive," replied the voice. "It was the first lift of the day, and the cabbie used the note to get some breakfast afterwards. That's when he saw the writing." "Anything else?" "Yes. It seems Grimmauld Place is a rather seedy neighborhood. He didn't like letting her off, but the girl assured him that she had relatives living there." Relatives, thought Daniel. Who? Aloud he added, "Thank you," and he disconnected. Daniel considered the information he had received. The corner of Cranbourne Street and Upper St. Martin's Lane was near Diagon Alley. That made sense. But Grimmauld Place? Why would she go there? There was nothing of interest or importance at Grimmauld Place. To his knowledge, it was a totally Muggle area. There wasn't even any magical residences there. Turning on the cell phone, Daniel dialed a number and made a call. The incessant pounding wouldn't stop. At first, Sirius Black thought it was a pounding headache, related to all the fire whiskey he had drunk last night. But that couldn't be right. Headache, yes, but not this non-stop pounding. That had never before happened in all the years Sirius had used fire whiskey to drink himself into oblivion. Gradually, Sirius came to realize the pounding came from outside his head, from somewhere else. "Creature!" he shouted. "Stop the pounding!" "Ooh," Talking hurt his head worse, but the pounding continued. It couldn't be Creature, Sirius decided. Creature would have stopped on a direct order. Sirius opened his eyes. Despite the blurry vision, he could tell he was in the dining room. A dirty mug lay on the floor next to him. It was tipped on its side. The remains of its contents spilled out on the floor. The liquid had soaked into his clothes. Finding himself in the middle of the floor came as no surprise. Sirius hadn't bothered with a bed in years, preferring to remain wherever he fell after drinking himself into a stupor. Using a chair seat for support, Sirius dragged himself up off the floor. He ignored the cold, wet sensation of fire whiskey from his soaked clothes that ran down his leg and onto his bare feet. Gripping the table, Sirius pulled himself up to an unsteady standing position. Usually he didn't bother to move when he felt this shaky. It was better to just keep his eyes closed and reach for the last lingering effects of the fire whiskey. But that pounding wouldn't stop. Leaning heavily on the table, Sirius staggered slowly forward towards the source of the pounding. Moving made his headache worse, but he wanted that pounding to stop. When he reached the end of the table, Sirius grabbed a heavy nearby chair and used it as a crutch to leave the dining room without falling. Sliding the chair along, he took a few steps forward into the entryway. The old-fashioned gas lamps immediately sputtered to life along the walls, providing light. Sirius took another step and then stopped in surprise. The pounding was coming from the front door. Someone was knocking. That had never happened before. It shouldn't be happening now. Sirius straightened. He took the final steps forward to the door, choosing his steps carefully so he wouldn't fall. Without warning, Sirius suddenly stumbled. His grasping hands caught the heavy troll's leg umbrella stand. It prevented him from sprawling on the floor. Sirius straightened, using the stand for balance. Then he reached out towards the door with a shaking arm. He could almost touch the doorknob. Leaning forward, Sirius took a final tottering step, quickly grabbed the doorknob, and rested against the door while he regained his balance. He could feel the vibration of the insistent knocking through the door. Sirius's trembling fingers gripped the knob tightly and twisted. He felt the latch release and continued to lean on the door while taking a step backwards, thus opening the door. "Lily!" he thought in amazement, staring at the blurry figure with a raised hand. For the young girl who stood in front of him looked surprisingly like a vision from his past, a long-dead ghost from his past. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you so early," began the vision, lowering her hand. She sounded amazingly like Lily, too, as she continued talking. "But do you know, or rather, did you know a Sirius Black?" Sirius stared in disbelief. Getting no response, the vision continued. "I mean, maybe somebody living here knew Sirius Black? I'd like to talk with that person if I may. It's terribly important." Her voice trailed off, and she looked at him hopefully, waiting for a response. "I'm hallucinating," Sirius decided while closing his mouth, which he discovered hanging open. Lily was long dead, and he knew it. She couldn't be standing in front of him. With his free hand, Sirius rubbed his eyes. His vision cleared, but the figure remained. She looked even more like Lily, and stood still in front of him, looking expectantly with those familiar green eyes. Sirius cleared his throat in a rough cough. "I'm Sirius Black," he finally told the vision. His voice came out sounding like a gravelly, grating croak. He rarely spoke when he could help it. The face on the hallucination broke into a sunny smile. "Are you?" it said. "Are you really?" the vision asked in her Lily-sounding voice. "That's terrific. I really need your help." She looked past him into the house. "Could we talk?" she added, her voice suddenly getting serious. Wordlessly, Sirius backed up, drawing the door further open as he moved. "I'm hallucinating," he said to himself again as the image walked in. "And now I'm having conversations with myself." Sirius shrugged. "Well," he thought to himself as he leaned on the door, closing it, "it's bound to be more entertaining than how I usually spend my days."